Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion today on the engagement of children in schools during the pandemic. My name is Caroline Alfonso, and I'm the education reporter at the Globe and Mail. I want to start off by introducing our panelists who are here with us today, and it's going to be a great discussion. Let's start with Tracy Viencourt. She is a professor and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you.
And then we have Jess Whitley. Jess is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa. Her research and her teaching focuses on inclusive education, mental health, and the intersection of the two. And welcome, Jess. And last we have Pino Buffoni. Pino is the Director of Education at the Renfrew County District School Board. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
So just before we begin our discussion, I just want to remind everybody in our audience that you can feel free to post your questions for our panelists in the chat function, and we will just get to them throughout our discussion, perhaps in the last 30 minutes or so. So feel free to type in your questions. To begin with, I'd like to start by asking each of you sort of a wide, broader question before we start getting down to the nitty-gritty. So the biggest question that I have right now is, what is the challenge facing public education at the moment? And I know that's a wide question, but maybe we just start with that. Tracy, can you lead us off with that?
I think one of the big challenges is recognizing that we have a need for safety in terms of infection of COVID or reducing infection of COVID-19, but also meeting the educational needs of students. So it's a real balance between public health and education. I think that's probably the main challenge I'm seeing right now.
Great. Jess?
I'd say for myself, because of the work I'm engaged in, what I think is the biggest challenge is continuing to improve our efforts to respond to and then really plan for the diversity that exists in the experiences of families and students and educators, and not easy as big school systems. But I think this is one of the big challenges that we have ahead of us right now.
And Pino, what are you seeing on the ground?
Good morning. I would echo the comments from Tracy and Jess. I think for us operationally, probably the biggest challenge before us is really re-envisioning, rethinking, and operationalizing our large complex institutions of public education for a much greater fluidity between in-person learning at school and online learning at home, which we're clearly seeing the multiple modes of delivery are getting to the kind of differentiation that Jess is talking about. And I would say, to add to that, to support Tracy's comment earlier, really the importance of moving beyond health and safety to rebalance academics, wellness, and health and safety as a dynamic mix as we move forward living and learning with the pandemic.
Great. You know, Pino, one of the things that I want to start off with is going back to the spring, when schools abruptly closed their doors right across the country. You know, students and teachers and support staff and educators all went online. And what did your board have to consider at that period of time? What were some of the things that you were looking to do for kids in the spring?
I think, Caroline, there were three major ones from my perspective on that. The first for us was a real large-scale shift in the continuum of the teaching and learning environment. And I say a shift in the continuum because it wasn't as if we were functioning pre-pandemic all in person at school, and we made this massive leap over to a virtual learning environment online at home. We really were already along that track. Pre-pandemic, we had flourishing e-learning and v-learning options for students, and I'll briefly explain the difference between the two. E-learning, of course, districts form part of a consortium, and so students can take a course from another district while teachers in our district host students from elsewhere as well as our own. V-learning is slightly different, where there's an actual physical class taking place. I'm just making this up here, but a grade 12 physics class with 7 students present, but another 5 students virtually coming in from another school, and another 3 from another school. So there are different modes of that continuum. So we really needed to take into consideration that shift in the teaching and learning. Some staff being very fluid and comfortable with that. And for other staff, I'm proud to say a real huge learning curve that they took on passionately and persevered through it. So the first key element would be that shift in the continuum from in-person and online to entirely online for the spring. The other 2 that were really critical for us was the procurement of devices for students and staff. We needed to, in the spring, mobilize, whether it was Chromebooks, laptops, or tablets for students who didn't have them essentially at home, as well as MiFi devices for students and some staff where they had connectivity issues, as well as paper packets that we were able to, thanks to our amazing transportation staff, bring every 2 weeks to students where there was no connectivity. So the second big item for us in the spring, not having foreseen the pandemic, was that procurement of devices. And I'd say the third one for us in the spring was a reckoning at some point in time, a realization that the kind of end of year activities that we've come to appreciate so much, including graduations, various rites of passage, so to speak, that are so important in families, that wasn't going to happen as it normally would have. So there was a real, towards the late spring, a real re-envisioning of what that could look like to make it special for graduating classes, for instance. But I would say those were the 3 key elements: a shift in our continuum of the teaching and learning environment, procurement of devices of various sorts for students and staff, and then how we manage the end of a school year when we came to the realization we actually weren't staying home for an additional 2 weeks from March break. We weren't going back at all.
Yes, I mean, you know that I have 2 young children in the system, and one of the things when we abruptly closed in the spring, we had to figure out how to have them learning at home through March to June. Jess, Tracy, I put it to you, what are we hearing about how kids did in that springtime? How did they do academically, mentally, emotionally? Jess, do you want to start?
Sure, that's been a big focus of our work in the past few months, and we started a research study right in March, trying to get a sense of what the experiences of families were who were supporting kids with special educational needs and exceptionalities at home. We were reading in your pieces in the news and other pieces that some families were really struggling, so we wanted to hear more about that. So some of the big ideas that came out of that, again, was the diversity. So there were some families who for whom the closing of schools represented a complete ending of services and supports for their child and their family. And unfortunately, the distance and the online options, although some of them were very creative in different areas of the country, often weren't able to replace what those families had been receiving beforehand. And so some of those families really, really struggled in that time. And really, I would say, their concerns overall were far more on the social emotional side for their kids than they were on the academic learning side. And we saw that in our surveys, we heard that in our interviews, and particularly those families who had, maybe kids with developmental disabilities for whom the relationships in school were really most of their relationships. They didn't have a huge social circle outside of school. They really relied on relationships with adults in the school. They relied on relationships with their peers and their classmates. And when those were ended, they really were left with almost nothing. And so when we looked at sort of the higher levels of stress among parents that we measured, the families who experienced the highest stress were those who had kids who had the poorest already developed social and peer networks. And that was just so challenging for those families. So we saw, some creative and innovative pockets in communities, for example, where, and even, some of the schools came up with some excellent ways of creating literacy circles, but I've got some great quotes from families that speak eloquently to just that complete loss, the loss and the grief that was experienced by their kids and themselves. when those relationships ended. So that's a big piece of our data that we are still hearing about since the spring.
Can you share some of those quotes with us, Jess?
I think I've got one for here. So about one of the kids that was talking about, or the parent that was talking about, it's a small thing, and even once or twice a week, it would have made a world of difference to feel connected to their peers. So we know, and Pina will know, and Tracy will know this, that in different areas, what was possible in terms of virtual connection between teachers and EAs and students really varied. So that was just, you know, board to board, province to province, there were different possibilities there. So this mom said it would have made a world of difference to feel connected to their peers, even if the teachers weren't teaching a lesson, or if they taught a lesson and then they had a way that kids could communicate and have a discussion on the topic, anything to help them feel more connected to each other. So that was a big piece. And I'll just grab one other one. So that spoke to the social emotional work and the development that's really necessary for some kids. That it was aggravating for me all of these years of work just for COVID-19 to happen, and the consistency went out the window. So that's horrible too. It's like building an empire with hard work, and then your work is undone, because with children like this, if you're inconsistent for a short period of time, you need to restart. So that was weighed heavily on some parents that we spoke to.
Yeah. Tracy, what did you hear about the spring closure and its impact on families?
So I primarily work in the area of children's mental health and violence prevention. So the parents that I spoke to and the kids and adolescents that I spoke to on average had a positive experience because school wasn't pleasant for them. So for example, this is something that I've spoken to my colleagues who are in psychiatry and psychology. Pino and I spoke about this at length too. What was striking is, for example, children and youth who have social anxiety disorder flourished. You know, the pressures of having to go to school and interact with others wasn't there anymore, and they still had a commitment to learning. Children who were bullied, who felt unsafe at school, did much better. So it speaks to the fact that we have this misperception that it was invariably bad for everybody. But in any system, there's enormous heterogeneity. And what it did for me is it highlighted that schools, and it's something I've always known, because again, what I study, schools aren't always good places for students. And so what I'm hoping will be born from this, a lesson, is how we can make it so that we meet the needs of more students.
That's so interesting. Pino, what was some of the takeaways, just building on Tracy's, what was some of the takeaways from the spring as you sort of prepared for the fall?
A few of the takeaways from our perspective, one is that, you know, we are able to shift our thinking, to shift our ways of doing things. When the context changes or the circumstances change, and I think that reinforced that there is an ability to adapt and adapt fairly quickly. But as Tracy and Jess have mentioned, it did also expose for us some of the struggles that we had pre-pandemic, you know, in-person learning or online learning in some capacity were exacerbated by the current situation. And really, you know, when you think about students who are vulnerable in some capacity, whether it's students who have some special needs that had some very unique programming and service options, the inability to provide that, or for students who were vulnerable in other capacities, you know, mental health as an example, anxieties, as Tracy mentioned, those situations came to light to an even greater extent. So I'd say we learned a lot about our ability to shift and learn and adapt. But we also learned that all of those challenges before us in meeting the diverse needs of learners were even stretched further in the context of the pandemic.
And how's it going so far, Pino?
I would say on balance, I think staff are doing a remarkable job. I would continue to add that some of the challenges we had pre-pandemic remain with us. Things like motivation, for learning, absenteeism, continuing to differentiate the needs of our learners, they still remain in place for us, whether students and their parents and guardians selected in-person learning to return to in schools or whether they pick the online learning option. Those are still at play. So I think there's learnings here along the way that we can take post-pandemic to ensure the system differentiates to a greater extent than we were in the past, but certainly some strengths to celebrate, but some areas of growth for us for sure.
There was a lot of anxiety heading into September, Pino, Tracy, Jess, like parents were anxious about the health and safety measures in schools. Many parents, especially in Ontario, chose online learning for those reasons, multitude of reasons, but primarily health and safety. Tracy, what are you hearing right now? What is your research showing on how things are going, how kids are faring in schools, how engaged they are in virtual school or sort of in school itself?
I'm sure that Pino will agree with this, and Jess, I know, has younger children, and so do you, Carolyn. I have teenagers, so I'm a little bit different phase. Pino has a teenager, but at the beginning, there was such a focus on health, the physical health and physical safety, that the reading, writing, arithmetic was kind of pushed to the side at the priority of getting us our hands washed when they should, you know, making sure our masks were worn and that sort of thing. And I often wonder, and there's no research that I've seen yet, of what effect that has on things like health anxiety. So it'll be interesting to see what became of that. But now what I hear from parents all the time is that, especially for young learners, it's all they know. So it's almost like we, because we have more of a reference point, we're making it bigger than their child is making it for younger learners. For older learners, it'll be interesting because you keep saying what the research says. And I want to say there's a huge limitation to the research right now. And the limitation to the research right now is that it's primarily cross-sectional. So we're making a lot of inferences without repeated measures designs. And that's problematic, and you can't make inferences about pre-COVID, post or current COVID kind of thing. But I would wonder, and it's just something that I keep thinking about, like, again, more older learners, we think that there's this lost opportunity for learning. And I wonder if it's going to have a more positive impact on their university and college experiences. Because the way they're being taught right now is exactly how we teach at university. You come to class for 3 hours on a subject matter, you go back and you do it mostly independently. And that's kind of like what we're seeing in schools for older learners. So anyhow, I didn't really answer it. I kind of gave you like all these caveats, but I just want us to be clear that the research isn't able to answer that question at this point.
Then anecdotally even, Jess, can you tell us how, you know, you spoke about how in the spring, children felt disconnected, especially kids with special needs, and families felt disconnected. Has that changed in their return to school?
I think it's my usual answer, which is it depends. That's pretty much
yeah, of
always
course.
my it depends answer. So we've definitely seen, you know, lots of kids go back. My kids are over the moon. They're just social kids, and they've benefited so much. I spoke to a few teachers last week. It was really interesting, who said that because they perceive the days as calmer and more consistent. There's no, at least in our region, there's no assemblies. There's no nothing. There's no PD days. There's no groups coming in. There's no groups coming out. The days are quite consistent and calm. And for some students and teachers, that actually feels good. It feels secure. It feels good. Then there's other kids for whom that's not the case. And actually, some of the families I've been speaking with recently, so one of the kind of safety pieces that Tracy talked about has been so paramount, is really limiting the number of people who can come into a building. And in some areas, that just means that also includes parents. So for some of these kids that are trying to be supported, and we know from everything that if there's a strong working alliance between the parents, the guardians, the family, and the educators and administrators, then, you know, the success of that child is just, you know, so much further along than if that's not in place. And although we've come far with technology, it just presents a potential barrier for the really coming together and working side by side and building those partnerships between families and schools, and even trying to figure out, do we even have parent councils? Oh, maybe we could, maybe we couldn't, but you know, we can't do this, and who's being left out of that conversation, who's being privileged through that. So it brings up a lot of equity concerns for the communities that I'm talking to. So I would say lots of positives, lots of pluses, and then some things that we need to keep trying to figure out. And as Pino said, those were difficult conversations to have before schools shut down. Now you've got people trying to connect virtually, which for some families makes it way more accessible. And then for others makes that real development of relationship way more challenging, which is having then a ripple effect on the well-being of the child. So those are some of the pieces that I'm seeing floating around.
That must be a huge challenge for school boards, right, Pino?
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly with the comments Tracy and Jess are making. You know, for us, I think we've really moved from a reactive response to the spring, where I really kind of look back and think we were all still in a bit of shock for the sort of March, April, May time period, to a more proactive planning piece for the fall, where we're really grappling now with, I almost see that spring period as having been a part of the pandemic, and now we're really learning and living with it. And to echo the comments made by my colleagues, I think we're really starting to turn a corner where we're taking a bit of and it's always going to be a focus, by all means, the health and safety, but not so neurotic a focus on the health and safety in order to balance out elements of achievement and well-being and equity, as Jess put, because of their importance. And I think ironically, you know, an overemphasis on health and safety is actually going to ironically be unhealthy for us. We need to bring those into balance and figure out ways innovatively and creatively to reintroduce some of the elements that our students are missing. I think the point raised by Tracy on you know, school being both a wonderful place for some students, but a challenging one for others. And Jess's point around the fact that it's become so consistent day to day that some of those bright spots in the school day that some students really rely on, playing on the volleyball team, whatever it might be, intramural sports, field trips, with the absence of them, we're trying now to start look at longer term ways to reintroduce some of that, to bring back into balance some of those mix of academics, wellness, and health and safety.
There's so much, as you mentioned, Pino, that kids are missing, you know, whether it's special needs kids having sort of adults in that building with them or missing out on extracurriculars. Are there some good things? You know, is it all that bad, or are there some good things, Tracy?
There are. I mean, with smaller, more controlled cohorts, bullying's down. So that's great, right? And it's down notably. We'll be presenting some information on this soon. So that I think is a bonus. I know that certain groups are faring better in terms of mental health. Mental health, schools can be an incredible stressor for certain students. And so I think mental health is improved for some students. It's worse for others, so it depends. I think really what this highlights, and I keep coming back to it, is the heterogeneity. And I think we've had a really uniform approach where there hasn't been a lot of flexibility. There's been some flexibility, but I think what's going to come from this, and I tend to be an optimist, that there's going to be some really important forced innovations to a school system that hasn't been moved for centuries, right? Like, the changes we've made have been tiny incremental changes, and this is going to force more dramatic, much needed changes. So although I recognize people have lost their livelihood, some have lost their lives, so I would never want that you know, part to be ignored. The truth of the matter is I think that there's going to be some good things that are going to come out of this too.
Can you tell me some of those? I'm kind of curious. I want to pull at that thread a little bit. What are some of the things that, you know,
I'll give one example. Yeah, and I'm sure Pino and Jess will have other examples, but so choice on learning. And so, you know, this idea that we could only educate kids with a teacher in front of the class and everybody sitting in their desk paying attention to that individual teacher, I mean, that's going to change. We're going to see more choice. I think we're going to see a reevaluation of assessment and examination, right? There is an embracing of social emotional development and learning. So it's really interesting because Jess mentioned it and Pino mentioned it. Really what parents were worried about was the social emotional component of schooling. And I've been arguing for this for 20 years. I feel like they're going to listen to us. I'm excited about that, where they're going to recognize that in truth, the first R of education is relationships, that education, learning, cognition is socially mediated. So things like this, I think we're going to see a change for the better. But I'll let Pino and Jess also add some good crumbs.
Please.
Absolutely. I agree with all those examples. Another one, Caroline, and I agree with Tracy, I think the pandemic has created an interruption that's broken a cycle that's been fairly entrenched in place. And it allows you that unique opportunity to step back and relook at it from a vantage point we probably would not have put ourselves in. We could have done it at any point in time, but we never really did. And so I think there's a unique opportunity here. I think assessment and evaluation that Tracy's hit on is bang on, including the nature of how we go about assessment is a wonderful opportunity for us to relook. And it also plays out as an organization to things like our work from home policy, which was fairly traditional in nature in the past. And we, on a dime, literally told everybody, grab your stuff. We're connecting on Monday. We're all at home. And we were able to run elements of the organization, not everything, but it's definitely making us now look back as organizations and as employers for fairly large numbers of people on those very policies and procedures. So I think there's an impact for students. A&E is a great example, but there's also an impact for us as an organization and how we function moving forward. And my final one as an example is the importance of enhanced partnerships like the one we've got going right now with public health. We've never worked this closely with public health, and they've always been a wonderful partner, but we are really consulting one another on major decision-making points for all the right reasons. So I think, again, as Tracy said, there's a window of opportunity here if we're open to seizing it.
Jess, would you like to add to that, sort of the threads that we're going to see as a result of this?
Yeah, and Pino made a great point there. So part of my privilege in the past year or so has been working closely with Nova Scotia. And I think it's important to highlight the fact that many parents were not given a quote unquote choice about where and how their child is going to learn across the country. Like it's not actually common that most kids just were offered the opportunity to be back in person, and that was about it. And so the work we've been doing in Nova Scotia has highlighted, to Pino's point, the public health aspect, which is fascinating, but it also provides a model for all of those community-based services and the different ministries and how there is possibility within communities. So what we saw in Nova Scotia was that there were lots of families and kids who were just, nobody knew where they were. Nobody could find them in the spring. And I know that's not unique to Nova Scotia, but like current phone numbers weren't working. So like, where were these kids? And especially in some of these rural communities. So what they figured out quickly was that there were local resource centers and community-based resource centers who knew families and who were connected with families really closely. And so the schools were able to then work with the community organizations to support families in that way. But without those key partners, they wouldn't have been able to access and even find families and kids. So that was a huge lesson learned there. But I heard so many wonderful learnings, particularly from this work in Nova Scotia. So I think about access to people like school psychologists and speech language pathologists. Well, traditionally I was speaking to one individual who would have taken like a 4-hour drive and a ferry to get to a community to see a kid who needed some supports. This is what would have been done. It would have been a day, a full day to see this one child who needed these supports that couldn't be brought together otherwise. Well, within a couple of months, they were able to figure out secure ways of bringing services online. And so it doesn't mean they won't still travel, but it means they can see 10 kids in the day and not just the one. Right. So that's just extraordinary access that we wouldn't have had without playing with these kind of scary online worlds and figuring out, you know, we can make this secure and we can provide better service as a result. So those are a couple of big pieces for me.
Can I just jump in on this? And it falls outside of the privilege of our panel to some extent, but so it's interesting because there's been this mounting evidence on therapy online. So for psychiatrists and psychologists delivering, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy online, and how the efficacy is actually better than in person. So there's been this mounting evidence. The pandemic then forced everybody to go online. As a consequence, you know, more patients were seen. Patients were seen in a way that they felt safer in a lot of ways. Wasn't ideal for absolutely everybody, because again, there's always heterogeneity, but it speaks to that. And that's so true, Jess. You know, having to travel 4 hours for a speech pathologist when you could do it online, and how many more kids you can serve. So there's going to be some good lessons learned from this. And I think that we're going to retain some of the things, and other things we're not going to retain. And that's fine also.
Tracy, I really found it interesting, the point you made early on about the kids who school is not a good place for them, right? School is not, we sort of think that, you know, I have 2 kids in school. They're happy to be in school. You know, the sound on the playground is joyous. It's great. But for many kids, school is not a good place. What is this pandemic teaching us about how to keep these kids engaged in learning in school? What are we learning here?
I think what we're learning is that it's pointless to engage them in that core learning, you know, that traditional learning, until we meet their fundamental need to belong. So we first have to fix that in order for them to flourish on the other side. Some will do well in isolation, but most kids, it's a biologically based need to belong. So how are we going to mitigate this? How are we going to manage it more than we have? If Tyler Black, who's part of our panel for the Children in Schools for the Royal Society of Canada, he's a child psychiatrist in Vancouver. If he was on the panel, he'd be telling you about how suicides are always higher when through the school days, right? So Monday to Friday, we have higher rates of youth suicides than we do on weekends, than we do in the summer. So school is a stressful place for a certain percentage of the population. I saw a video the other day online of a mother crying and saying about how her daughter got up really early because there was going to be a new kid at school and she has no friends. And so what she wanted to do was present herself the best she could. So, you know, she fixed her hair even more than she normally did, made sure she had her best outfit on, you know, was practicing with her mother how she was going to introduce herself, because she thought this will be my only hope to get a friend. Like, these kids are just everywhere. And so we want them to do well in spelling and arithmetic and social studies, and all they want to do is belong. So we have to really attend to this. And what I like is that, you know, we used to have to, in a sense, convince educators and convince parents that the stuff that we did that they considered soft academics really mattered for the harder academics. And I don't think we have to convince them as much, because they were all on the same page, where most of them were on the same page when they saw how much their kids needed the social aspect of education in order to flourish.
Are educators more focused on, you know, this first few months at the start of the school year? Are educators more focused on sort of social, emotional well-being of kids? Academics sort of take second place. I mean, I don't want it to take, you know what it's not second place, but it does. Is that what's happening right now?
Yeah, I think it's a bit awkward because the way the school year is constructed, secondary versus elementary, it's different. Especially what was traditionally year-long courses became most typically semesters, and now we're at quadmesters where you've got 4 quarterly points in the year, and some school boards are at octomesters where you're doing one subject in a time period in order to manage the health and safety elements of cohorts mixing, that kind of thing. At elementary, it's slightly different, but I think the point you're making is well taken. Relationships are fundamental, a strength-based approach that's appreciative in nature. I think the pandemic has exposed both strengths of our system and areas for growth, but it's also demonstrated the importance of those relationships, especially in an online context or a context that flows between in-person and online, because it's much more difficult in a virtual setting to be able to make some of those connections that you would normally have done in the first few days of school. Really proud of staff's intuitive understanding of that. It probably, to Jess's point earlier, has reinforced the importance of it with staff and with students. And I'll tell you, Caroline, I was speaking to a couple of teachers who have come up with some really neat ways to get to some of the other emotional elements. For instance, a teacher was telling me from our system that she creates recess times in the online environment where she steps away from the computer and the students just engage. And they just have a time to chat like they would have in an indoor recess or lunchtime in school. She's there, she's in the backdrop, she's monitoring, she's moderating the session, but she's stepping away to allow the students some time just to talk about whatever it is that they're the topic of the day for an 8-year-old kind of thing. So I think there's neat ways to get to some of that for the sense of belonging that Tracy's talking to. Its importance. The other one I would add very briefly, some of our parents and guardians saying, look, we know there's anxiety for our kids at home, but as one of my colleagues said, he had to pull his son out of the basement because it had been 6 months that he had only been out twice. And, so that parent saying, I know that's not good either. I've got to find a balance here for my kids because I know they prefer to be in the basement, even doing their work, but I know they've got to socialize too. So there is this continuum that every child, I feel, is on somewhere. And as adults, we just need to make sure it's not an all or none. We find that right place for every student. And I think, to the points raised by all of us, this interruption to the way the system always was allows us to re-envision it in a different way that gets a little more to that kind of thing.
Jess, would you like to add to that, sort of what you're hearing about the social emotional well-being of kids?
I was thinking of, one of the kind of mantras in my courses that with my BEd students is around, you have to get to know your students to be able to teach them effectively. And we've all spoken to some of the challenges that have come up around that. But one of the examples I kept hearing over and over again and talking to the Nova Scotia educators was that when they actually went to kids' houses to drop off at-home learning packets and USB keys and Chromebooks, it gave them insight into the lives of children and families that they thought they knew before, and now they understood. So they would have said, oh, of course, I always bring choice into my lessons, and I know for secondary in particular, I know my students, I know where they're coming from, I know what's relevant for them. And it brought to life for them that they really didn't know, or they really didn't understand. They didn't understand food insecurity. They didn't understand the complete lack of broadband and internet access, that some students were standing with a phone in a field trying to get their lessons for the day. Like, they didn't really get it, and now they get it. So they have the opportunity to really do differently based on what they learned during that really extraordinary time driving down roads, dropping off USB keys. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had that insight. So that's what I was thinking of.
Amazing. I just want to take a question from the audience, and feel free to type in your questions as we go along. We don't have very much time, so I'll try to get to as many as we can. Tracy, this question is for you. You pointed out how important relationships are. And from where you sit, why is that R so important? And how do we scaffold from this experience so that the so-called soft skill takes its rightful place in the center of our learning modalities? Is it small cohorts that made it more evident, or is it something else?
Well, there are world examples that we can turn to. And we wrote an op-ed in the Global Mail about how, academically speaking, the kids are going to be all right, even if we're disrupted for a year. Not meaning all kids, of course, but we were basing that on the basis of what we see in Scandinavia and in Finland. And there, the priority in the beginning of schooling is on relationships. They have small cohorts that stay with the same teacher, the same group. They follow up together for 3 years. then they move over into a new cohort. And, you know, it's interesting. I was just in Norway before the pandemic, a couple of months before the pandemic, and one of my colleagues was telling me about how they were going to have a conversation with the other parents in the classroom because the girls weren't getting along. So his 5th grade daughter wasn't getting along. There was a lot of issues with relational aggression, and the parents were going to have a meeting. And I said, I don't understand. What do you mean the parents are going to have a meeting? Like, you mean like in the parking lot and somebody like be holding a bat? Like, what's going to happen? I don't understand this. How are you going to get a hold of the parents? Like, he's like, well, what do you mean? We're all in the same group chats. We talk to each other all the time. So like, that's so different from here, right? Kathleen, we know there are examples in the world of how this is done, but there's enormous pressure on Pino and other educators in terms of assessment and examination, and we need to change that. So we measure what we value and we value what we measure. And we have standardized testing in Ontario. So I know we value mathematics, and I know we value reading, and I know we value, you know, literacy. But how come we don't value the social emotional development of children? The new evidence that's coming out shows that when you invest in social emotional learning programs at school, reading, writing, and arithmetic improves using standardized assessments and other forms of assessments. So there is a way to do this. We just need to encourage and gather support from the non-educators. I know the educators recognize this, but if Pino wants to implement this in a school board and all the parents are saying, hey, you just took away 2 hours of math from our students this week, they're going to fall behind, he's going to have so much pressure to then acquiesce to their demands. But if Canadians in general understood these links, parents understood these links, then I think we'd be in a much better place to enact it.
Do you think we are at a turning point here?
I think we may forget our interest in social emotional learning once the pandemic's over, but I'm hoping we won't. Again, I'm an optimist at heart, so I'm hoping we won't.
Jess, do you want to jump in here? Do you think?
Always.
We are.
Yeah, I think we need to, one of the great ways that we could move forward is just completely doing away with the division that we situate between social emotional learning and other kinds of academic learning. There is no division. You can't learn without social emotional aspects being part of the way you look at the material. How are you perceiving it? How is your whole history with the subject playing in at this moment? What is the room like? How is there safety for risk taking in your classroom? We cannot separate these things out. There is no curriculum without social emotional learning. And I've seen throughout the country that, you know, we have a new math curriculum, a new HPE in Ontario that have social emotional like explicitly linked through it. And this is the same in other provinces. We cannot separate these out and say Tuesday we do math and then we're going to switch to a body break where we do social emotional learning and then come back. There is no division between these things.
Pino, what are you hearing around this?
I'm loving this conversation because I equate this discussion on the interplay between you know, academics and wellness, achievement and well-being, like the old computer lab where you only want to use the computer on Tuesday at 9:45, but then at 10:15, you never got to use the computer again. We've evolved. We know this connection that Jess is talking about. I would say for us strategically, that's at the heart of, it's really interesting. We've just released a document in Renfrew County called Inspired Learning, and it speaks to what Tracy and Jess are talking about here. The interplay between the core skills of literacy and numeracy, which remain important, but also the kind of competencies for the future, collaboration, creativity, the way we communicate. All of those elements are as equally important, and they are also part of how we link to the curriculum, our past knowledge and experience, as Jess said, and how that guides what we think going forward. Those are all almost inseparable. And I think trying to separate them creates a false construct. The other one I would add is the nature of our subjects and disciplines. This notion that mathematics is only over here and covered in this way, and science is covered here, and yet there's lots of science in the arts, and there's lots of mathematics and music, and there's lots of science and geography, that interplay across disciplines. This, what I'm really hoping for, Caroline, to be honest with you, is post-pandemic, a bit of a pandemic pause for us not to jump back or snap back into old ways of doing things while we're longing for some of it. I get it. But if we can take a pause, and actually some of what we're doing here is starting to think forward about this, saying, okay, let's say a vaccine is out and what are we taking forward, and how are we using this, really optimizing this interruption to create a new normal that gets to some of the issues we've been talking about and some of the inadequacies of past models. But there's no question it's strategic. You can't throw out key elements of literacy and numeracy just to do the competencies. You will get the kind of pushback Tracy's talking about. You've got to be able to work that through in a scaffolded way to help people see the value in assessing our growth in other areas, including collaboration or whatever it might be. So exciting times ahead, because I think we've got that opportunity to do it. And as Tracy said, I think people are more open to it than ever before.
Yeah, it's a good point, Pino, about taking a pause after this and sort of re-examining what went wrong, what went right. I wonder how that is going to happen, or if that is going to happen. That is the big question, Tracy. Do you think there is space for that? Do you think there will be the will for that?
I do think, but I don't think there would have been if this pause if COVID hadn't happened. As Pino mentioned, we're entrenched in a traditional way of delivering education, and we're all educated this way. So this is the challenge of being a child psychologist and being an educator. Everybody was a kid once. Everybody was a student once. So we all have implicit knowledge about what's going on. And we tend to project on what worked for us must work for everybody else, right? So it was so entrenched. I think that this will be the silver lining from COVID, is that it has forced us to rethink it. And then people will be less worried about innovation. It's forced innovation, and it's going to be good innovation for sure. But there's also things that I just want to add one thing that we haven't talked about. I want to talk about recess. And the reason I want to talk about recess is that one thing I find that it comes back to social emotional. So we have this thing where when things get tough, we want to then focus on these core academic subjects without recognizing the importance of things like recess. Now, recess can be toxic for many kids, but we don't expect people to work without taking a break. We don't expect adults to work without a reset. And I worry that as things progress and people are worried that the academic stuff is sliding, as the weather gets worse in Canada and we're taking snow days, that we're going to then say, we're going to forego recess in order to manage our time. So I'm just going to say this right now, we cannot do this, right? It serves an important function in a child's day, a student's day, adolescents and children. And so we need to be mindful of its place in education.
I think you'll see a bunch of under 10-year-olds protesting if we take away recess. It would be the end of their world.
Yeah, and I think in schools right now, like what I hear from my kids and see around our neighborhoods, is that there is so much more outdoor time, and their educators have really, and administrators have worked hard to organize the day, to sign up for slots, to get more outdoor time. And it really is the time in the day, especially for those kids for whom sitting still in a row, like maybe this is the first time they've had to do this because they have plastic shields around their desks, that they really can, within their quadrant, they really can move. They really can interact with each other in more natural kinds of ways. And I think that, to everybody's point, it's integral. But I still worry about the teenagers, because to Pino's example of kids sitting in the basement, the whole recess concept, when I just walked by, looked more like smoking across the street, just for that group I happen to be walking by. So the extracurriculars that many of them are trying to recreate now and reimagine, but that is their link with school, is taking part in those extracurriculars. Without that organized piece for many of them, this is a make or break kind of year for them. So it's
Yeah.
them I worry about.
And there are boards, Pino, that are trying to bring some semblance of extracurriculars back for high school kids. I mean, it's not the same as last year, and it can't be the same as last year. What are you seeing? Is your board doing anything like that? What are you hearing from other boards?
Yeah, we're very much so, Caroline. I think we're one of a number of boards, and we're definitely not alone, that are starting to find ways to do this, to be honest with you, because it's happening anyway. So the students are assembling in their non-cohort grouping, so to speak. And so we're trying to find ways, rather than manage that in a rigid fashion, to say, okay, you know, the most recent example at one of our high schools is the Dungeons and Dragons group. And they love getting together on this. And I don't know a lot about Dungeons and Dragons, but I respect the fact that it's there. We're trying to find ways to have them connect, because they're doing it in their unsupervised time. So rather than have a sort of a false discussion around, well, no, you can't get together, we know it's happening. In fact, if we can help facilitate it for them in areas they want, and that's one example, there are others. It's a little more complicated, I understand, with some of the sports because of elements of contact, but wherever we can make it happen, we're starting those discussions to see that through, because of Jess's point and Tracy's too, that connection for them, it's a social thing, it's a peer thing, it's a connector to school and a sense of belonging that we want to honor. So I really, I really think it's important that we do that. The other one, Caroline, I just want to mention, you know, we've got to be careful not to equate learning to some linear time aspect. So a day lost of school doesn't necessarily equate to a day lost of learning. And I think we've got to step away from trying to feel, when we get out of the pandemic, like we've got to catch up, because I think that catch up is different for every student, for every adult. But I also think some students in there, you know, a skill of today that's really important, self-directed learning that Tracy mentioned earlier, they've grown leaps and bounds in the last, 3 to 9 months. So I think we've got to be careful that we don't just simplify the learning trajectory, which I feel isn't linear anyway. We do spurts and spats of learning, and there are times when we're really growing in our zone of proximal development, and other times when we're not. So I just think it's important that we don't just see things as, well, we've got this break of, you know, however long it lasts, and then try to catch that up in its time element, because I think it's more complicated than that.
And, you know, Tracy, you'd written that piece on the kids are going to be okay academically, generally speaking. Yeah. And we're seeing some data out of the US and out of Europe about learning loss. And we're not seeing much in Canada. Can you speak to that, Tracy, and sort of what needs to be done there, if anything?
Well, I don't think we can, first of all, readily compare ourselves to the United States. So and I'll just say why. One of the particular things about Canada is that we don't see a difference between private and public achievement on academic standardized testing. So that right away says that we have better equality in our education system than the United States, where there's pronounced, like, enormous differences between the private system and the public system. I'll be curious to see what happens in this regard, because we may be measuring it too early. And I'll give you an example with bullying about why you have to wait till things grow up. So when we look at the links between bullying and academic achievement, what you see is that kids who are bullied tend to have lower academic achievement. But in truth, it's mediated by school attendance. So if you just measure it in a really short time frame, you think that this is the association. If you bring out your assessment period, what you see is that kids who get bullied stop going to school. And when you stop going to school, you don't learn. And that's why you have a hit on academic achievement. So I want to see what this is going to look like longer term. So maybe when we're using measures that are sensitive to change, maybe they're using standardized test scores that are, you know, sensitive to the learning environment, the immediate learning environment. But maybe there's going to be things that we're going to see down the road. When you think about the stuff like investment in early childhood education, it didn't look like it had an impact on education, but it had an enormous impact on teen pregnancy rates, delinquency, 10 years out. So I would be cautious in thinking that there's a learning loss. It'll be interesting to see, because there may be learning gains we never even anticipated.
That's interesting. Jess, what do you think about that? I mean, you know, there's been remarks made by sort of bigger organizations about a generation of children behind. What do you make of those?
I don't agree, I guess, is the flat line on that.
Why?
I think for kids who are already struggling, they struggled more. And I think that there were lots of kids who, I have reams of data on kids who were well supported by parents who either had government assistance when their jobs ended or who were home already, who saw remarkable gains with respect to having individual support. They learned to do an incredible number of things around their home and in their community. So many of these kids really moved along. And I think that learning means lots of different things to different people. And I always remember, because I actually went to grade 13 in Ontario, and we had these such scary discussions about like, what'll happen when we cut out grade 13? Nobody will be prepared for university. Like, this will just be a disaster. I thought, like, I don't think it quite had the impact that we think it would have. So I'm as a researcher, as Tracy says, I'm always going to wait and see the data. I think we need to be very cautious around how we measure things like learning and measure things like loss. But I think it's a much more nuanced and complex conversation, and it's not going to lead to a headline that says kids are 3 years behind and they may never catch up, and we're going to have a whole generation who are just unable to add and subtract because some schools were closed and we had a pandemic. So I'm not there.
And Pino, on the ground, are teachers sort of, what are they saying about, you know, the academics of kids coming into this school year?
I think that certainly the comments that Tracy and Jess have made are absolutely accurate. Our teachers, you know, they've got such a good understanding of the teaching and learning environment. They know it's not a formulaic, linear experience, so they have a good understanding of that. One of the things that the pandemic has brought to light, like the example of reevaluating paper and pencil examinations for 3 hours or 2 hours, and there are other modes to assess. There are also other modes by which we can diagnose the entry level of a given student or a subject area. And I think our teachers have been very good at getting to that, knowing that the environment's a little bit different. It's erased and really enhance the awareness of that. I think that's the kind of thing we have to propel forward. I love the notion of not seeing this in a linear way, because I also think, well, how can we accelerate the learning coming out of this in various areas? What strategies do we put in place to do this? So our teachers have done a remarkable job, considering no one saw this coming on March 12th.
Right.
They did an amazing job adjusting to this. I think I have to commend our Federation Union partners, who have also been really cooperative in seeing this through as an organization. I think there's lots of opportunity to learn and grow. There are gaps that students have had and continue to have. Not sure we can attribute them all to COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We just have a couple more minutes. So I just want to wrap up by asking each of you what we need to pay attention to going forward. What is the one thing we need to, there's many things, but what is the one thing we need to pay attention to? Tracy, would you like to start?
Well, I'll speak as a scientist. I think we need to pay attention to the data, but to not make causal inferences from cross-sectional data. It's just going to cause harm.
Jess?
I think relationships and how we think about those and how we can improve those across the system.
And Pino?
I would say the continued integration of achievement, well-being, equity with health and safety along the way, that we see this in a different light and we take those opportunities to learn from what we've experienced to propel them forward.
Thank you. You know, this has been fascinating. Thank you, all of you. I feel like I could speak with you for another hour on this. Like, there's so much ground to cover here. There's so much going on. And, you know, I think all your perspectives were so worthwhile. So thank you for coming on, and thank you for sharing your perspectives today.
Thank you, Caroline. We were lucky to have you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.